The first wife of King Henry VIII was Catherine of Aragon, and she is deemed in history to have been very unfairly treated. She was pushed outside in her marriage to the king as Henry's eyes wandered towards Anne Boleyn, one of her ladies-in-waiting, and Catherine would fight for her status as a queen. Her husband Henry demoted her eventually to that of a dowager Princess of Wales, due to the fact she had married Henry VIII's brother Arthur Tudor, who died inside of Ludlow Castle, shortly after they themselves had tied the knot. But Catherine would have a very tough end to her life, as following being banished from the royal apartments, she was virtually held under house arrest inside of Kimbolton Castle. But what is captivating is that Henry VIII would order a huge tomb for his first wife, who he then hated, to be buried. But then this was desecrated. However, 200 years after her death, the coffin of Catherine of Aragon was disturbed and was opened. What those people who did this found was shocking. Catherine of Aragon was a queen who would rule England alongside her husband for some time, and she was the longest-standing wife of the notorious Tudor king, but she is buried inside of Peterborough Cathedral today, which is shocking considering her role in history. It would have been expected that she would have been buried inside of Westminster Abbey, but this is not the case. Catherine died inside of Kimbolton Castle on the 7th of January 1535 at the age of 50. But Henry had a lot of input with regards to the funeral of his first wife, and he would later complain about the amount of money he spent on it. Henry chose Peterborough Cathedral for a number of reasons, as this was relatively close to the place where she died, and he ordered that Catherine should be buried with all of the honours of a dowager Princess of Wales, meaning that she was demoted to the wife of the deceased Prince of Wales, as in the wife of his brother Arthur. This was a huge disgrace when compared to the work she had done as the Queen. For her funeral there was a large state procession with many noble ladies there to take part. There was a lot of black cloth provided for the women to wear mourning veils and other garments, and Henry VIII would bemoan the cost he spent on his first wife's funeral, and because of this he made sure that he did not spend a lot of money on the memorial or the burial. Catherine is not necessarily buried in a grand or ornate tomb, but simply under the floor. More on this shortly. It was said for her burial arrangements that the right excellent and noble princess, the Lady Catherine, daughter to the right high and mighty Prince Ferdinand, the late King of Castile, and late wife to the noble and excellent Prince Arthur, brother to our sovereign Lord King Henry VIII, and she would be buried with this title. She was now considered the sister-in-law of Henry VIII, and she was not in death referred to as a queen. Her body was embalmed and her vital organs had been removed and buried elsewhere from her body, and preparations were made for the funeral in many ways. Clothing and veils for the mourners and ladies of the household of Catherine were made, and, as mentioned, this cost Henry VIII a lot of money, and for this he complained, and he would then refuse to pay any more, and he kept Catherine's funeral service simple and straightforward. Her procession to the place of burial began at Kimbolton Castle, and the body had been placed in a thick coffin, and her remains inside of this were encased in lead, and they had also, it's believed, placed her entrails in a separate chest. They were wrapped in cerecloth, a thick wax cloth that would preserve the body well. When it left Kimbolton Castle, the procession was large, and the hearse was pulled to Sawtry Abbey, where it rested for the night before it continued on to Peterborough Cathedral, or Abbey as it was known. The coffin of Catherine of Aragon arrived and was carried into the cathedral, which had been richly decorated with symbols of the deceased Catherine and the English monarchy. The man who led the funeral service and preached the sermon was John Halsey, who would replace the executed Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher. He would preach a sermon with Henry VIII, who had involvement in, and he would tell lies that denounced her, and he claimed that during her final moments Catherine said that she was not a queen and had never been the rightful Queen of England. This was seen as distasteful and disrespectful, and the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who would have told the emperor about this, was kept away. Henry VIII, following her burial, would create a fine tomb for his first wife, despite the fact he hated her by this point, and he delivered on his promise to give her a decent burial, despite the pro-Anne Boleyn propaganda. Nothing of this tomb remains, as during the English Civil War, parliamentarian soldiers destroyed it and caused chaos inside of the cathedral. However, what is shocking is that in the 18th century there was an exhumation of Catherine of Aragon's coffin that took place, and her coffin was opened and sadistically tampered with and disturbed. There were no real, legitimate reasons to disturb the resting place of a queen who had by this point been buried over 200 years. There had been rumours for many years that Catherine of Aragon was not buried alone, and some believed that she was actually buried with Catherine Willoughby, a prominent Tudor woman who some believed could have even become at one point Henry VIII's seventh wife. But this was then investigated, and to do this in 1777, officials inside of the cathedral decided to open the tomb of Catherine. They lifted the flagstones which were under where the tomb had been destroyed, and they opened the grave. The grave was opened, and the investigators discovered that there was only one coffin, and this was Catherine of Aragon. There were no other coffins. However, officials decided that to open the coffin would have been disrespectful and unnecessary. However, one of the witnesses took matters into his own hands. He was armed with a drill, and he would place this on the coffin, and he then drilled a hole into the coffin of Henry VIII's first wife. And after this, he slid a wire into the opening he had created. This had a hook on it, and he pulled and hooked a part of the black and silver fabric which Catherine had been buried inside of. He took this part of her clothes from her body, ripping them, and then when he brought the hook out of the coffin to inspect it, he noticed there was a distinct smell of embalming fluid which still remained centuries on. But when the fabric emerged from the coffin, it hit the air and disintegrated and perished. This was the only time that Catherine of Aragon's remains were broken into, and the coffin was then reburied, and in later years modern tombs have been made for her, with the last being a Victorian one, which links her to being a Queen of England. However, what is bizarre is that the coffin of Catherine of Aragon was drilled into and damaged, and this small hole caused a huge amount of damage to her body. It's believed that as her body was now exposed to the air, that a significant amount of decomposition would have happened to her remains, and that the embalming fluid to keep the former wife of Henry VIII's remains preserved well was in a battle against the elements and exposure. This is a shocking thing that witnesses have caused so much damage, but has never been held accountable for. At the end of her life, Catherine of Aragon was held under virtual house arrest, and she would be banished from royal court by her husband, Henry VIII. Henry's treatment of Catherine in her later life was a stark contrast to the early happy marriage that they had, and he was drawn towards younger women at court who he had his eye on. But Catherine would have her coffin broken into by a curious official who caused a significant amount of damage when visiting Catherine's burial place today. You notice there is no huge tomb or effigy of her, just a simple slab that marks her site of burial. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.